She thought he was just another pushy man in the wrong line, until the moment she realized who he really was and what she had stopped him from doing. It was the kind of morning Julia Wagner had perfected. Precision, not spontaneity. Munich International buzzed with its usual rhythm, efficient, polished, emotionless, just how she liked it. She checked her watch. 2 hours until departure. Plenty of time to board, review her keynote slides for the AI Leadership Summit in Silicon Valley, and arrive with the quiet authority of a woman who'd earned every step of her power. Julia moved through the terminal like a knife through silk, unbothered, measured, focused. Her navy suit was pressed to symmetry, her heels clicked with practiced confidence, and the metal clasp of her designer briefcase flashed under the terminal lights like a badge of triumph. 15 years in tech had taught her two things. No one hands you respect, and every room sizes you up in the first 5 seconds. That's when she saw him. At the first-class counter, amid a handful of sharply dressed professionals, stood a man completely out of place. Tall, built, with broad shoulders hunched slightly forward like they'd carried real weight. Not just corporate strategy. His leather jacket looked older than some of the business travelers around him. His jeans were faded and loose, his boots muddy near the sole. A gray duffel bag sagged at his side. The cap on his head obscured much of his face, but what little she saw showed lines and sun-darkened skin. He looked working class, American, maybe Austrian. She couldn't tell. What she could tell was this: he didn't belong in this line. Julia hesitated for a moment. The attendant was still assisting the passenger in front. The stranger stood calmly, not fumbling, not confused like he had every right to be there. But she'd seen this before. People hoping no one would call them out, hoping their confidence alone would carry them through. She stepped forward, controlled, not aggressive, but her voice was firm enough to quiet the nearby chatter. "Sir," she said, eyes locked on him, "this is the first-class line. Economy is that way." For a moment, everything slowed. The man didn't react with surprise, no indignation, no apology. He just turned his head slightly toward her, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of the cap. His face held something ancient like carved stone and something tired. And then he did the unexpected. He smiled, not mockingly, not amused, just a small, soft smile. He gave a slow nod, not to apologize, just to acknowledge, and turned back toward the counter. No words, no protest. Julia's lips pressed into a thin line. She expected at least some explanation, but he gave none. And then she heard it, one of the passengers behind her, a teenage boy perhaps, whispering to someone, "Dude, is that him? No way." Another pulled out a phone. The soft click of a video recording, starting barely audible over the airport hum. She forced herself to remain composed. The line moved forward. When it was the man's turn, the airline agent looked up and smiled broadly. "Mr. Schwarzenegger," the agent said warmly, with a tone too familiar to be mistaken. "You're all set. Enjoy your flight." Julia's breath caught, just briefly. She blinked once. Twice. No, it couldn't be. The man accepted his boarding pass with a polite thank you in a thick Austrian accent and stepped aside, moving with the quiet ease of someone used to watching everything from the edge of a room. He didn't look at Julia, not once. And that somehow made it worse. When she reached the counter, the agent's expression had returned to neutral. Julia gave her information and accepted her pass, but the voice in her head was louder than anything in the terminal. Had she just... She didn't finish the question. In the first-class lounge, she sat near the window, pretending to scroll through emails, but her eyes drifted to the glass. The man was out there now, walking slowly along the tarmac view, chatting briefly with a flight attendant who had clearly recognized him too. No one was taking selfies. No one crowded him. And still, he seemed like a figure the world turned around. Arnold Schwarzenegger. Of course, the jawline. Even under the cap, the posture, the build. She had seen his films, read a few business interviews, but she had never expected him to look so quiet, so worn, so utterly disinterested in proving who he was. And that, perhaps, is what unsettled her the most. Julia Wagner was a woman who had spent her entire life demanding the world see her, recognize her, respect her. And yet this man had stood there dismissed, insulted, and never once corrected her. He let the moment pass, not out of weakness, but something else entirely. It lingered. As the boarding call echoed overhead, Julia stood and adjusted her blazer. The control was back, the armor fastened tight again. But the image of that nod, that quiet smile, followed her down the jet bridge like a shadow. And for the first time in a very long time, Julia Wagner wasn't sure she liked the reflection staring back at her. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The cabin of the first-class section was quiet, cocooned in soft lighting and the hush of insulated luxury. Julia Wagner stepped in, expecting ease and silence, the final reward after a long morning of confrontation and schedule watching. But the very first thing she saw him, the man in the leather jacket, the same broad back, the same quiet presence. He was seated, row 2A, a window seat, first class. She paused slightly, enough to register the seat number, the certainty of it, the way he leaned back as if the chair had always belonged to him. The same duffel bag rested neatly under the seat in front of him. Not a word was said, not a glance exchanged. Julia moved past him, her throat suddenly dry. She found her seat 3B and sat down carefully, her bag tucked precisely beneath the console. It was unavoidable. His presence. Even in silence, he filled the space. She had assumed, wrongly, that the gate agent had let him slip through. Maybe a clerical mistake, but there was no mistake here. The flight attendant approached him with practiced warmth. "Good afternoon, Mr. Arnold. Would you like your protein shake now or after takeoff?" Julia heard it clearly. Not Mr. Schwarzenegger, just Mr. Arnold. Familiar, almost intimate, as though they'd spoken many times before. He nodded, that same slow nod from earlier. "After takeoff. Thank you." The accent, thick, unmistakably Austrian, pulsed through the syllables. He wasn't hiding it. He never had. Julia reached for her tablet, swiped open her slides, and tried to disappear into charts and talking points. But her thoughts didn't obey. Her eyes flicked to the side. She saw another attendant offer him a warm towel. He accepted with a smile, then wiped his hands, folded it neatly, and placed it aside. Julia told herself it didn't matter, that her reaction was simply human. First-class lines exist for a reason, and people in them usually look a certain way. It wasn't prejudice, it was pattern recognition, efficiency. But even as she told herself that, she could feel the stares, not from him, from the people who had been nearby at the gate. A woman 2 rows ahead glanced back once, then turned away quickly. Julia felt exposed in a way she hadn't since her early startup days. When men interrupted her mid-sentence and funders asked who the real founder was, back then, she'd burned with fury. Now, it was something else. Guilt, maybe, or something harder to name. The man Arnold unbuckled his seatbelt halfway through taxiing. Julia blinked, surprised, then saw why. A late-boarded passenger was hobbling down the aisle. An older man, thin, shoulders stooped, walking with a cane and a noticeable limp. His boarding pass shook slightly in his wrinkled hand. The flight attendant rushed over. Arnold stood, quietly, gracefully. He picked up his duffel and gestured toward the man's pass. A quick exchange followed, low-voiced, almost invisible to others, but Julia caught it. "He can take my seat," Arnold said. "I'll move to the back. I think he needs this more than I do." The old man protested, flustered. Arnold simply put a hand on his shoulder, gently, and said, "Please, I insist." The flight attendant looked unsure. Sir, you don't have to. I know, Arnold replied. That's why I want to. The older man was eventually seated in Arnold's original spot. Arnold walked calmly toward the rear, disappearing without fanfare. Julia sat frozen. Her screen had dimmed. Her fingers rested on the tablet, motionless. The passengers around her had seen it. No one clapped. No one made a scene. But the atmosphere shifted. Respect, silent and total, floated through the cabin like gravity itself had changed. Julia stared out the window, unable to concentrate. Her mind grasped for context. Who was this man? The Arnold Schwarzenegger she remembered from headlines was brash, loud, made of punchlines in politics. But this man, this was different, more restrained, more grounded. She wanted to say something. When he returned from the back seat, reassigned somewhere near the galley, she imagined herself standing, walking over, apologizing. But she didn't. Not because she didn't mean it, but because in the world she had built for herself, pride still lived at the top floor. She was afraid, not of him, of what it would mean if she admitted how wrong she had been. Outside the window, clouds covered the sky. Inside her, something began to shift. Not a storm, not yet, but the weight of something unspoken, pressing slowly against the wall she had built. Something she would have to face sooner than she thought. Somewhere above the Atlantic, while the engines hummed and the cabin lights dimmed, the air around Julia seemed to slow. She had half a mind to sleep, but her thoughts were loud, too loud. Her screen glowed blank. Her coffee had gone cold, but it was the low sound of a conversation, just ahead, that drew her in. Arnold had returned to a seat 2 rows up, near a young man traveling with what looked like a film crew, maybe a documentary team. They spoke in hushed tones, respectful, but not secretive. Julia didn't mean to listen. At first, but the cadence of his voice, thickly accented, deliberate, and warm, made it impossible not to. The young man asked him something about resilience, a standard question, maybe, but Arnold's answer was anything but rehearsed. When I first came to America, he said, I had $30. That was it. No English. Just dreams and muscle. He chuckled softly, and the young man leaned in, recording casually on his phone. I lived in a small apartment with 5 other guys, slept on the floor some nights. During the day I trained, then worked laying bricks. At night, I cleaned gyms. Sometimes, I slept in one. Julia glanced up, her fingers hovering over her tablet. She had known of his fame. Of course. The world knew Arnold Schwarzenegger, Mr. Olympia, the Terminator, the Governor. But this voice was not from the billboard. This was something else. When I tried to get into acting, he continued, they all said no. They laughed at my name, my body, my accent. No one will understand you, they said. You sound like a villain from a war movie. He paused. One director told me, with that face and that voice, you'll never be a lead. Maybe if we redub your lines. His tone wasn't bitter. It was reflective, even amused. Julia found herself holding her breath. She had delivered talks on inclusion, on being the only woman at the table. She had fought her own battles, but she had never pictured this man in the trenches. Not like this. I never changed my name, he said, his voice softening. I worked harder. I learned the language. I built my own brand, brick by brick. Not because I was welcome, because I knew who I was before they did. The young man asked something Julia couldn't hear. Arnold answered after a moment. There's a kind of strength in being underestimated. It teaches you to speak through action, and to never explain the fire in your chest to someone who's never felt cold. Julia's eyes stung unexpectedly, not because his words were dramatic, but because they weren't. They were real, grounded, and suddenly memories surfaced her first investor meeting, where a venture capitalist looked past her to address her junior male associate. The headline that called her Tech's New Iron Lady as if being formidable was unnatural in a woman. The time she was told to smile more in boardrooms that valued charm over truth. And here she was now, after clawing her way to the top, judging a man she didn't recognize simply because he didn't look like he should be standing where he was. She shifted in her seat, unsettled. Arnold's voice continued, quieter now. I didn't succeed in spite of the rejection. I succeeded because of it. Rejection teaches you who you are. If you listen too closely to critics, you'll end up living a life that's not yours. Julia turned her face toward the window. The sky outside was endless, blanketed in blue-gray light. But in her chest, something cracked. She wasn't angry at him. She was angry at herself, at how easily power had made her forget what it felt like to be dismissed, at how quickly she had become the very type of person she once swore she'd never be. The young man thanked him. Arnold nodded, gave a light pat on the shoulder, then reclined quietly, closing his eyes. No more to say. No need to say it louder. Julia leaned back slowly. She didn't know what she would do when they landed, but she knew, without question, that something inside her had shifted, not because Arnold had told her to change, but because he hadn't needed to. And that was the real power. Quiet strength doesn't demand attention. It reveals truth and then leaves it to you to deal with what you see in the mirror. The dinner service came quietly. Warm trays, folded napkins, stainless steel cutlery that clinked softly against porcelain plates. Julia sat stiffly in her seat, posture straight, hands folded in her lap as if the meal were a test of decorum. Across the aisle, Arnold sat silently with a modest plate of grilled salmon and vegetables. He didn't fuss, didn't scroll his phone or ask for substitutions. He simply ate with the calm focus of someone who knew how to be present. Julia tried not to look, but her eyes drifted, again and again. Something about his stillness made the air around her feel noisier. She distracted herself with the wine list. German Riesling, California Cabernet, French Burgundy. She picked the Burgundy, strong, red, a statement wine. When the flight attendant returned and poured it carefully into her glass, Julia exhaled and relaxed her shoulders slightly. Her tablet was tucked away. No emails, no meetings, just altitude and silence and the long stretch of sky outside. Then it happened. A moment's carelessness, maybe turbulence, maybe nerves. The wine glass tipped, just barely, but the damage was immediate. The deep red liquid spread like a wound across her ivory skirt, staining fast and mercilessly. Julia gasped, eyes wide, heart kicking against her ribs. She grabbed for a napkin, but it was too late. The tablecloth was wet, her skirt soaked. A few heads turned. A soft murmur rippled through the cabin. Before she could move, a large hand appeared with a folded cloth napkin. Arnold was already beside her, kneeling slightly in the narrow space between seats, dabbing gently at the spill. "Don't scrub," he said in that quiet Austrian accent. "Blot, like this. You'll save the fabric." His voice was calm, unhurried. His eyes didn't search hers, didn't pity her. They simply saw the situation and helped. Without judgment. Julia froze, lips parted but speechless. She was the kind of woman who always controlled the room, always helped others, not the one who needed helping. "Here," he said, handing her a second napkin. "This one's dry. Switch it now." She took it wordlessly. Her hands trembled, just slightly. The scent of wine mixed with cologne and something else, humility. He stood up again, slowly, and returned to his seat without another word. Julia glanced around. A few passengers looked away politely, but she saw it in their expressions. The shift, not quite amusement, not quite pity, but something she hated, the look reserved for someone who had lost control. She turned her gaze toward the window, fighting the heat rising in her face. After a moment, she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "I'm sorry. For earlier." At the gate, there was a pause. Then, his voice, low but clear. "Don't be," he said. We all have bad days. That was it. No lecture, no sarcasm, no grand moment of forgiveness. Just a man who could have held it over her and didn't. Julia swallowed. She wasn't used to kindness without a cost, especially not from someone she had misjudged so publicly. She expected a lesson, a performance, but what she received was worse, or better. She wasn't sure yet, because what Arnold had given her wasn't just mercy, it was dignity. And it made her feel small, not because he was famous or powerful, but because he had chosen grace when he had every right to do the opposite. As the cabin lights dimmed for the night flight, Julia sat quietly with a damp skirt and a heart fuller than she expected. She had spent her life fighting to be taken seriously. She had become hard-edged, calculating, precise. But tonight, a stranger had reminded her of something she didn't even realize she'd lost. What she thought was strength had become armor, and for the first time in years, she began to wonder what might live underneath it. The terminal was quieter than usual, a rare hush falling over LAX in the early evening. Julia stepped off the plane and moved through the familiar rhythm of disembarkation with mechanical precision. She barely acknowledged the terminal signage or the murmurs of passengers collecting luggage. Her mind was somewhere else. A dull ache had started to settle behind her eyes, a mix of jet lag, shame, and something harder to admit. She passed by a customer service desk where a group of airport staff were huddled over a screen, laughing gently at something on a monitor. A young agent caught her glance and smiled. "Just watching something from this morning," he said. "Pretty amazing, actually. You probably saw him." Arnold. The name made her stop, involuntarily. The agent noticed. "You were on that flight, weren't you?" She nodded slowly. He motioned to the screen. Security cam caught this. No audio, though. Julia stepped closer. The footage was grainy, overhead, but unmistakably real. There was the gate. The same one. A timestamp showed it had been captured minutes before boarding. And there he was, Arnold, wearing the same worn jacket, standing calmly at the counter. He wasn't confused. He wasn't out of place. He was speaking with the gate agent, animated in gesture but never rushed. The clip showed him pulling out his boarding pass, pointing to it briefly, then turning and gesturing toward a man seated nearby, a much older man, hunched over with a walking stick resting between his knees. The veteran. Julia's stomach tightened. Arnold pointed again, lightly touched the counter, then raised a hand as if to say, "Let me." The gate agent hesitated but nodded. And then there she was. Julia entered the frame from the side. Controlled. Direct. The angle showed her approaching with purpose, her mouth forming the words she now remembered all too clearly. "Sir, you're in the wrong line. In the video." Arnold paused mid-sentence. His body turned slightly toward her. No reaction. No defense. He merely nodded, then returned his attention to the agent. But the momentum had shifted. The agent looked away. The screen behind them changed. A new passenger was called forward. The conversation ended. The moment was gone. Julia stared at the screen. Her breath caught in her throat. She had interrupted not a man who didn't belong, but a man offering kindness. And not just any kindness. He had been trying to give his seat away. To that veteran, silently, without announcement, without the world watching, and she had stopped it. With judgment, with arrogance, with everything she had once hated being on the receiving end of. The video played on. Arnold stepped back. The camera didn't catch expressions well, but something about the way his shoulders dropped ever so slightly said enough. The clip looped. Julia backed away from the desk. "Pretty amazing, huh?" the agent said again. She forced a nod and walked away quickly, her heels clicking too sharply against the tile. Her face felt hot, her throat dry. The buzzing in her ears returned, louder now. The magnitude of what she'd done landed in full. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was the kind of moment that separated people not by class, not by celebrity, but by choice. The choice to act with grace, the choice to offer something without credit, the choice to look beyond yourself. And she had failed, not because she was malicious, but because she had assumed, and in doing so, she had erased something beautiful before it could bloom. In all her years of climbing, of proving herself worthy in rooms filled with doubt, she had believed she'd earned the right to judge. But power, she now saw, didn't mean clarity. Sometimes it made you blind. She reached for her phone out of habit, then stopped. There was no one to call, no statement to issue, no press release to spin it right, just a truth she would have to live with, and a man who had already forgiven her before she even knew what she had done. The conference room in Berlin was sleek, sterile, and flooded with morning light that cut across the polished table like a judgment line. Julia sat at the far end, palms resting on a black leather folio. She had asked for this meeting, no assistants, no PR filters, just the executive team, half jet-lagged, half curious, waiting to hear what the usually unshakable Julia Wagner had to say. She stood slowly, adjusting the lapel of her blazer, eyes steady, but the tremor in her breath giving her away. "Before we begin," she said, her voice clear, "I want to speak candidly about something that happened during my trip." Silence. A few exchanged glances. She continued. "At the airport in Munich, I misjudged someone, publicly, harshly. I believed he didn't belong where he was, and I acted on that belief. It turns out, he not only belonged, he was trying to do something profoundly generous for someone else." She paused. "And I got in the way?" No one spoke. Julia looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up. "This isn't damage control. There's no scandal here. But there is a responsibility. I acted with prejudice. That's not the culture I claim to represent. So, I'm offering my resignation." A quiet intake of breath rippled through the room. The CFO blinked. The head of HR leaned forward slightly, but no one responded right away. Julia remained standing, letting the discomfort land. After a moment, the chairman of the board cleared his throat. "Julia, before you go any further, there's something you should hear." He reached into a folder and pulled out a printed email. "This arrived yesterday." He passed it down the table. Julia took it, brows drawn. It was from the U, so an S. The sender, Gerald Thomas, the elderly veteran from the flight. She read in silence. He had written not to complain, but to thank. He described being approached by a man he didn't recognize at first, Arnold, and how that man had quietly offered him a first-class seat. But what struck him most wasn't the offer. It was the presence of a woman. She seemed upset, tense, but as the flight went on, I saw something change in her. The letter read, "She didn't know I was watching, but I did. I saw the way she listened, the way she looked out the window like she was remembering something she'd forgotten. It moved me." Julia stopped reading. Her throat tightened. The chairman spoke again. "He said you reminded him that everyone has the capacity to shift. That impact isn't just what we do intentionally, but what we do when we think no one is watching." He looked at her firmly. "Julia, we don't want your resignation." Her mouth parted slightly, stunned. "But we want your leadership," he said. "If anything, this shows you're capable of reflection, and more importantly of evolution. We need more of that. Especially at the top." A pause, then the CTO chimed in. "We've been talking for months about launching a mentorship initiative for young women in tech. You're the perfect person to lead it." Julia sat back down slowly, not out of defeat, but out of humility. Her heart was beating loud in her chest, but this time it wasn't panic. It was something closer to renewal. She had walked into this room ready to give up everything she'd built, but the consequence she received wasn't punishment. It was purpose. Real, grounded, hard-earned purpose. And for the first time in years, Julia Wagner didn't feel like she had to defend her position. She just had to use it for someone other than herself. The conference hall was filled with young faces, bright eyes reflecting ambition, curiosity, and a hunger for more than just success. It was the annual Women in Tech and Leadership Summit, and this year's keynote speaker, Julia Wagner, stood behind a sleek podium, her name projected on a screen behind her. Though it wasn't her name that had drawn the room silent, it was her story. She stood calmly, a quiet presence in a dark suit, no notes in hand, just a folded piece of paper resting beside a glass of water. "There was a man I met not long ago," she began, voice steady but warm. "He didn't wear a name tag, didn't announce himself. In fact, if you saw him that day, you might have thought like I did that he didn't belong where he was." A ripple of stillness settled over the crowd. He stood quietly in the first-class line at an airport, worn jacket, soft-spoken. Nothing about him said important, and I told him he was in the wrong place. She let that land. The audience didn't laugh. They didn't murmur. They waited. "What I didn't know," Julia continued, "was that he was trying to give his seat away. To a veteran, he wasn't asking for credit. He wasn't performing. He was simply doing the right thing. And I got in the way of that because I thought I knew better." She looked across the audience. Some of them leaned forward, brows furrowed, hearts opened by the confession. "I spent years fighting to be heard in boardrooms, to be taken seriously in a world where being a woman in tech was a daily negotiation of worth. And somewhere along the way, I became so focused on earning my seat that I forgot why I wanted one in the first place." A pause. Then she smiled gently, but with a trace of humility that only comes from being broken and rebuilt. "That man," she said, "never once made me feel small, even though I tried to do exactly that to him. When I apologized, he just smiled and said, 'Don't be. We all have bad days.'" On the screen behind her, a photo appeared. It was slightly grainy, clearly candid, taken with a phone. Arnold stood beside Julia near the airport gate, casual, relaxed. Behind them, on the wall, someone had scribbled on a poster with a marker, "Don't be. We all have bad days." Laughter bubbled up from the crowd, soft and real. "In my office now," she said. "That photo hangs where I can see it every day. Not to remind me of my mistake, but to remind me of what kindness looks like when it doesn't need a spotlight. What leadership feels like when it comes from humility, not hierarchy." She stepped slightly aside from the podium. "This mentorship program," she continued, "this community we're building, it's called Just Arnold. Not because it's about one man, but because it reminds us that greatness doesn't need to shout. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply shows up, helps quietly, and walks away without needing to be noticed." A few in the front row wiped their eyes. Others nodded, visibly moved. "And maybe," Julia added, her voice softer now, "the best leaders are the ones who remind us of who we were before the world told us to harden. The ones who meet us at our lowest, offer grace instead of judgment, and let that moment grow into something better." She didn't linger. She didn't wait for applause. She simply gave a small nod and stepped down from the stage. The applause came anyway, thunderous, not for performance, but for the vulnerability she had allowed them to witness. And somewhere, not in that room, but somewhere quiet, a man in a worn jacket was probably lifting weights or tending to his garden or laughing at a bad joke told by an old friend, not thinking about the story he left behind in a terminal, not expecting legacy, because the kind of legacy that matters most doesn't need reminding. It lives quietly in the people who choose to pass it on. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.